So one thing that I had struggled with for quite some time was remembering things from books that I had previously read. If someone was to ask me or you, tell me some learning points that you took away from the book that you read, say 4 months ago, we may well find it really hard to even remember a single point. And this happens, in fact, even if at the time while we were reading it, we thought like, wow, this is actually some amazing content and it might even change my life. Despite this, 2, 3, 4 months later, or 2 to 3 books later, we can't even remember the simplest of points from previous books. So why is this a problem? Well, this is a problem because in simple terms, you're actually wasting your time. If you're reading a non-fiction book, I'm assuming that the reason you're reading is you want to take something away. You want to take some learning points away and you want to implement these into your life. And if this doesn't happen, then what is supposed to be a personal development or a learning endeavor then becomes a pastime. It becomes procrastination, and there's so many other things that you could do instead of wasting your time. And to further emphasize the issue, if you engage in hours of reading and you multiply that by the number of books you read in a particular year, then it means that a sizable portion of that time, if you haven't taken away anything from it, has just flown by. This is why it's so important that you have a system in place to make sure that you're actually extracting value from the time you're spending reading. And look, at the end of the day, if you're doing something different and you're watching Netflix and you're doing it purely for entertainment value, then at least the value you're getting is entertainment. But if you're sitting down with the purpose of self-development and learning something new, and you're not getting that out of the reading, then it just doesn't make sense and it actually becomes quite sad. So now, having highlighted the problem, one thing that I do then is think about the mindset that I go into reading with. And the main thing that I think about is I'm not actually studying. I'm not in school, I'm not studying for an exam, and no one's going to ask me multiple choice questions on whatever I'm reading. Me and you, we're doing this in our free time, out of our own volition. And it's probably something that we actually enjoy. And this is why the mindset should be of that of enjoyment and fulfillment rather than doing work by force. Take the example of someone who watches a TV show. When they watch a show, rarely do they feel like they're forcing themselves to do it. They have turned on the TV show because they think it is something that they'll enjoy, and they also enjoy watching it throughout. Equally, when reading in your own free time, when you're not studying, without being forced by anybody or your teacher, the same similar excitement should exist within that reading. Now, you might be asking me, why is this mindset important? This mindset is important because throughout the process of reading and writing, you'll need to be doing things that might seem like work, but shouldn't be viewed with that lens. If you view them as enjoyment, then you won't feel like you'll need to force yourself to do those things. There will be no friction to enter those tasks. Now, once the mindset has changed, then you need to go into step 1. And step 1 is slowing right down when you're reading. This is quite contrary to what the narrative is currently online about reading. You'll find lots of content online about how I speed read or how I read 2,000, 3,000 books in a year. If you read a book in 3 days, can't understand any of it, can't recall any of it, then how useful was that time spent? If your intention is true learning and understanding, then you won't be caught in by this false metric of reading more books in a short space of time. And slowing right down will allow you to do 3 things. Number 1, it allows for critical reading. And critical reading favors understanding over simple reading. Let me give you an example of an extract that I read a few years ago in the book Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell. So I've got the book here on page 42. Let me read this extract in simple reading. The other interesting thing about that 10,000 hours, of course, is that 10,000 hours is an enormous amount of time. It's all but impossible to reach that number all by yourself by the time you're a young adult. You have to have parents who encourage and support you. You can't be poor, because if you have to hold down a part-time job on the side to help make ends meet, there won't be time left in the day to practice enough. In fact, most people can reach that number only if they get into some kind of special program, like a hockey all-star squad, or if they get some kind of extraordinary opportunity that gives them a chance to put in those hours. Literally, right now, I read this extract and to me, it just seems like a bunch of words, letters put together. And yeah, I understand the sentences somewhat, but what's the essence of this extract. What is the author trying to tell us here? Let's try to understand the essence of this extract through critical reading. What the author is trying to tell us here is that in order to master a field, it takes a minimum of 10,000 hours. And this is the rule that this author covers generally in this book. And 10,000 hours is not actually a small amount. If you put that into days and nights, then that's 416 full days and nights. And if you have reached that at a young age, then most likely you would have come from a wealthier family. A family that can support and provide the necessary conducive environment to allow those hours to be put in. So if it's a sport, they would need to pay for lessons or pay the fees for a club, or in fact have enough money so they can have the time to take you to training. And if you're a bit older, say 16, 17 or 18, and again, you're from a less wealthy background, then some of your time might be spent working in a part-time job. And that means that some of those finances will go to maybe supporting yourself or supporting your family. But it also means that a lot of that time or free time that you have where other people are practicing, you're spending that time working. Now, slowing down a little bit allows for that sort of critical reading where I could have reached that understanding. And you might reach a different understanding. That's fine, as long as we're both close to the intended understanding or what the author wants us to understand. If you had just sped read through that, then that extract would just have become a bunch of letters that make up words, that make sentences that you recognize are English, but kind of means nothing to you. Number 2, slowing down allows for reflection and integration into your current understanding. If we use a bit of reflection on the extract we just read, we recognize that the aim or the argument of the author is to suggest to us that children who come from wealthier families are more likely to be successful than children coming from less wealthy families, not necessarily because of intelligence, but because of the opportunities that are available to those who come from slightly wealthier families. And yeah, that's a great learning point, fine. But let's be a bit more critical here. If it is the case that you have to come from a wealthy background, then why is it that we see so many children or so many people who come from poorer backgrounds in sports like football become absolute masters in the field? Are there times where coming from a less wealthy background or a poorer background is not actually a hindrance to success? Well, these are some nuances here about this extract because some fields actually require far more investment financially than others. Take the example of tennis. It's most often people from a certain demographic background that become very successful in that sport. This might be due to the huge financial burden and expenses that are required, such as, rackets or equipment and shoes and paying for classes. Sometimes you need one-on-one coaching in order to become good at that sport. The parents would need to have free time in order to practice with the child because it's an individual sport. And oftentimes within tennis, the children would start at the age of 3 or 4. And in particular, at that age, they actually have a lot of expenses. And oftentimes the parents have just started within their careers, so are not able to afford those sorts of expenses. They would also need to pay for rent, bills, and other household things. Whereas if the parents are a bit older or come from a wealthier family too, then they have that extra money to pay for additional expenses such as tennis expenses. Contrary to that, football is actually a far cheaper sport. You only need one ball between 22 players. You can play on any field or any surface. Goals, alright, let's just make some makeshift goals, put some bottles and that makes the goal. Training is also a lot cheaper and the kids play in school all the time. The other thing is that there are advantages of not playing organized football. If you're playing out in the streets, then you're not completely regulated or restricted by coaching. And so it allows innovation and it allows the kids to think outside the box and play in an unorthodox style. See, what we've done here is thinking in a critical manner. We've extracted our understanding of the current world and applied this to this extract that we've just read. You can actually integrate this even deeper into your current understanding by thinking about what else you've read on the topic and linking it to that. If you read about deliberate practice or attention residue or distractions, that will form a bigger picture in your mind and also help you remember it more. Now, number 3, slowing down will allow you to visualize and think about how you can implement the content into your life. Going back to our extract we read, you can think about how much money do you have to invest in your field? How will it affect the field you choose to be involved in? How has this affected your own upbringing? And what extra skills and advantages has this given you? And what disadvantages has it given you? And knowing that you need to reach 10,000 hours roughly makes you think about how you can schedule your time to reach those sorts of numbers. Once you've changed the way you actually read the books by slowing down, you can move on to step number 2. If you make sure that you do critical reading and integration, then you'll find that you actually take much more away from the books that you read. But then comes the problem, I don't actually want to forget all these amazing things that I've just learned. And the solution for that is very simple. You just have to write it down. And this is where the mindset that we spoke about earlier is really important and key, because you're not writing as part of an essay that you're taking to school, or because you're going to have this essay marked by your teacher, or it's going to be for uni or whatever. You're doing this again because of your self-development, because you enjoy this. And so it shouldn't really be that hard to spend some time writing about what you've learned. And what I personally do is invest in a note writing app, so like Notion or Obsidian. And this allows you to eventually build a library of things that you read about. And it allows you to store those reflections in your own words so that you can retrieve them at a later time. Writing your reflections down allows for 2 things. Number 1, you don't lose what you've learned. Number 2, you can retrieve it at any time you want. Bonus point is that if you write something in your own words, even if it's just a small amount, when you read it, it actually allows you to remember things in a much more colorful way. It allows you to remember what you read in a colorful way. Take this example here. I wrote this back in 2020, which is 4 years ago, which is a summary of the book Shoe Dog, written by Phil Knight. And Phil Knight is the founder of Nike, and he, in this book, just describes the timeline and the story of the inception of the company. This is a very small summary where I included the timeline and then I included just a few learning points. And rereading just one of the points from 4 years ago felt like it transported me back to the time when I was reading the book. And it brought back some reflections that I hadn't actually put down on paper. I wrote a few words, but it reminded me of a lot more. Step number 3 is discussion, and it essentially just allows you to close the loop. I always take the opportunity to discuss some of the things that I've learned when I meet with other friends. Again, you're not in school, you're not being tested, and it's not an exam. Just like you sit and discuss TV shows with your friends and you suggest to them really good shows to watch, discussing, reading, and learning points should be just as enjoyable. And the discussion allows for one main thing. It allows you to recall the information and the learning points without actually having to refer to your summary. It allows you to share your learning and essentially teach in your own words. And even if you have to refer back to your summary, the retrieval pathway would definitely be strengthened. There are tons and tons of psychological studies that shows that recall improves and strengthens the retrieval of information and those pathways. So I don't need to tell you those studies today. The other thing that discussion facilitates is your friend's input into what you read. The thing is, other people will have a different viewpoint and have a different nuance on specific information. And this will allow them to share viewpoints with you that you hadn't seen before. And it just adds to your understanding further. And honestly, what I find is that once I have discussed some learning that I recently read from a book, it essentially just completely sticks after that. And once I've done that 2, 3, 4 times with other people, then there is just no way that I'm not going to remember the book that I read last time or the book that I read before that.